An elderly man, frail and 89 years old, walked into a cafe and quietly asked for a sandwich. Instead of compassion, he was met with disdain and humiliation. Among the cafe's patrons, however, a well-dressed woman noticed him, her gaze drawn to something on his wrist. Her heart skipped a beat as she focused on it, and she froze. She approached the man, and, upon closer inspection, her face drained of color. The air was filled with the soothing scent of freshly brewed coffee, accompanied by the soft hum of conversation. It was an ordinary day, yet a strange stillness enveloped the room when the door swung open, revealing an elderly man. His steps were slow, as though burdened by the weight of time. Jape, 89 years old, looked worn out by the years he had lived. His body, frail and hunched, carried not just the toll of age, but the scars of a life full of hardship. His ragged clothes offered little protection against the biting chill, and his shoes, worn and thin, left his toes exposed. As he moved through the room, his hands shook, and he ignored the disapproving looks and hushed murmurs of the other customers. He could feel the sting of their judgments with every step. His empty stomach urged him to press on, though each step felt like a battle between his pride and his need. Jape kept his gaze low, dreading the obvious scorn in the air. He knew he was unwelcome, but had no other option. Arriving at the counter, he placed his meager coins on the surface. Marcella, the cafe owner, a middle-aged woman known for her sharp manner, gave him a disdainful once-over. Her apron, once pristine, was stained with coffee spills, but the look she gave JP was far more tainted, filled with prejudice. "I'd just like the cheapest sandwich, please," JP said, his voice barely above a whisper, barely audible over the quiet murmurs around him. His fingers, dirty and trembling, fumbled with the few coins he had, trying to appear confident. Marcella crossed her arms and stared at him coldly. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she sneered. "If you don't have the money, don't bother." Her words hit Jape like a slap, leaving him shuddering with humiliation. "I'm begging you," Jape whispered, almost pleading, the desperation in his eyes evident. "Anything you can spare? I'm hungry." The atmosphere in the cafe grew heavier, thick with tension. Whispers swirled around him, and some customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one came to his aid. "Do you think you can just walk in here and ask for free food?" Marcella scoffed, leaning in close to JP, her voice dripping with contempt. "We don't have leftovers. Go somewhere else." The murmurs turned into quiet laughter. One customer with a sarcastic smirk shook his head. "That's right. Get out of here, old man. We don't want your company." Tears welled up in Jape's eyes, but he stood frozen, unsure whether to leave or push for a little more. His stomach growled loudly, the shame of his situation consuming him. He felt invisible, as though his entire existence was being judged in that moment. The silence was suffocating. Just when it seemed like all hope was gone, the cafe door opened again, and this time, it was a woman who stepped inside. Isabella, an elegant and confident figure, walked through the room, catching the attention of every patron. With her perfectly styled brown hair and sharp suit, she exuded an air of authority. Her gaze immediately swept over the scene at the counter, and without hesitation, she made her way toward it. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Marcella, who had been oozing arrogance just moments before, suddenly faltered when she realized who had entered the cafe. Isabella was no ordinary customer. Known throughout the city for her luxury boutiques, her presence commanded respect. "What's going on here?" Isabella's voice was firm, but there was a clear disapproval in her tone as her eyes landed on JP, who was still standing motionless, struggling to hold on to whatever dignity he had left. Marcella stammered, trying to regain her composure, but Isabella was undeterred, and the whole cafe waited in suspense for what would happen next. Isabella's gaze never wavered from JP, and with a soft, reassuring smile, she reached out her hand. "Don't worry, sir," she said. "Today, your lunch is on me." Jape looked up at her, stunned. His tear-filled eyes were now filled with disbelief, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. Isabella turned to Marcella, who was still trying to regain control of the situation. The once palpable tension between JP and Marcella now shifted, focusing entirely on Isabella, who radiated an undeniable strength. "I've already told you," Marcella protested, trying to keep her authority. "This man cannot be served here." Isabella remained calm, but her eyes held a fierce intensity that made Marcella hesitate. "I think you're mistaken," Isabella said, leaning slightly forward. "We're talking about a human being, not some stray dog, Marcella." The cafe fell silent as the patrons, who had once enjoyed watching Jape's humiliation, now shifted uncomfortably, witnessing this unexpected confrontation. Isabella stood tall, her composure unwavering as she refused to back down. I'll pay for anything he needs, Isabella continued, her tone unwavering. He has as much right to be here as anyone else. Marcella sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. We don't offer charity here. If he can't pay, he shouldn't be here. This isn't about charity, Isabella replied, her voice calm but tinged with irony. It's about humanity, and you seem to have forgotten that. She stepped closer to the counter, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. I've been a customer here for years, and I never thought I'd witness something so inhumane. Whispers spread throughout the cafe as the patrons reflected on what had just transpired. Marcella, visibly flustered, was well aware of Isabella's strong reputation. Confronting her could damage her business, but her pride kept her firm. This isn't a charity center, Marcella muttered, crossing her arms in a feeble attempt to strengthen her position. Isabella let out a short, almost incredulous laugh. You talk about charity, but you treat a person like he's less than human. Charity is a choice. Humanity shouldn't be. JP, who had been silently absorbing the exchange, now began to grasp the full weight of the situation. He'd never imagined that anyone, let alone someone as powerful as Isabella, would stand up for him. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and astonishment. Isabella noticed the change in him and leaned in closer, speaking softly. You can order whatever you like today, she said with warmth. This one's on me. Marcella, still angry but unwilling to escalate things further, muttered, Fine, but don't think this will happen again. Isabella smiled, unbothered. What won't happen again? She asked. How you treat people here, because I'll make sure everyone knows how your business operates. Marcella froze, realizing the weight of Isabella's words. Meanwhile, the other customers, though unwilling to directly intervene, were now reconsidering what they had just witnessed. As JP settled into a chair at the table, still under Isabella's watchful gaze, the waiter hesitantly brought over his meal, a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He placed them before JP without saying a word, clearly reluctant to engage in any further confrontation. Jape, still in disbelief, stared at the plate, his trembling hands hovering over it, as if unsure this moment was real. He took a deep breath, willing himself to accept the kindness he had never expected. Go ahead, eat, Isabella encouraged, her tone gentle. It's yours. You deserve it. JP, still overwhelmed, nodded and took his first bite. His hunger seemed to wash away the shame and humiliation of earlier, and as he chewed, he felt a sense of relief he had not known in a long time. Isabella watched him closely, a mix of compassion and something deeper, something she couldn't yet name, filling her heart. As the cafe returned to its usual hum, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just unfolded. And then, as Jape adjusted his watch, something caught Isabella's eye. A familiar glint shimmered on his wrist, a watch she knew all too well. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The glint from JP's wrist was unmistakable. It wasn't just any watch. It was the same brand, the same model, and the same vintage design she had seen countless times before. But there was one difference. This watch had been hers. For a brief moment, she was frozen in disbelief. The watch on JP's wrist wasn't just a luxury piece. It had been a family heirloom, her late father's prized possession. It had been stolen from her years ago in a robbery that had left her shaken and angry, but most of all confused. How could it be here now on the wrist of this frail, elderly man? Isabella's mind raced. She knew the watch had been sold on the black market after the robbery, but she never imagined that it would end up here in the hands of a man she had just met. There was no way this could be a coincidence. Slowly, she approached him again, her eyes not leaving the watch. JP, still deep in his meal, didn't notice her movement. Isabella's voice was gentle, but laced with an urgency that only she could feel. Excuse me, sir, she began, her heart pounding. Where did you get that watch? Jape looked up, startled by her question. He blinked, as if unsure whether he'd heard her correctly. His hand instinctively moved to cover the watch, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Isabella. It's mine, Jape replied hesitantly, his voice raspy. It was a gift, long ago. Isabella's gaze softened, but the suspicion remained. There was a story behind that watch, one she needed to know. A gift? She repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. From who? Jape shifted in his seat, his eyes drifting to the side as though the memories were heavy and difficult to carry. He hesitated, then spoke in a quiet voice, as if afraid of revealing too much. It was from my son. a long time ago, before everything changed. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. A son? Could it be that this man was somehow connected to her father's death? She wasn't sure, but the possibility gnawed at her. Jape's voice faltered as he continued. He he was taken from me, in a way. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't stop what happened to him, and everything fell apart after that. Isabella's mind was racing, but she kept her voice calm, though her hand trembled slightly. Who was your son? She asked quietly, the words barely escaping her lips. Jape looked up at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of pain. For a long moment, he didn't answer, as though the weight of the question itself was too much to bear. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. His name was Daniel Westbrook. The name hit Isabella like a tidal wave. Daniel Westbrook, her father's business partner. The man who had been found dead alongside her father that fateful night. The man whose disappearance had haunted her for years. Isabella's chest tightened. Daniel Westbrook? She repeated, the name tasting strange on her tongue. JP nodded slowly, his eyes welling with tears. Yes, my son. The cafe fell into an eerie silence as the realization washed over both of them. The man sitting before her wasn't just some frail old man in need of food. He was a father who had lost everything, his son, his dignity, his sense of self. And now, this watch, which had once symbolized wealth and status, now carried the painful history of loss and regret. Isabella's thoughts raced as she processed the magnitude of what JP had just revealed. This was no longer just about a stolen watch, or even a simple act of kindness. It was about a tangled web of loss, betrayal, and unanswered questions. I'm sorry, Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. She wasn't sure if she was apologizing to Jape for the pain she had just uncovered, or for the part of her own family's history that she had never understood. I didn't know. I didn't know it was you. Jape shook his head slowly, as though the years had taught him that forgiveness was rare, and that sometimes it didn't come. There's no one to forgive, he said quietly. We were both victims in our own way. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. The once bustling cafe had become a place of deep reflection as patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to respond to the unspoken tension in the air. Isabella finally stood up, her decision made. I'll help you, she said, her voice resolute. You don't have to go through this alone. JP looked up at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. You would help me, after everything? Isabella smiled, though it was tinged with sorrow. You're not the only one who's been hurt, Jape, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other heal. And with that, the last of the silence in the cafe was broken. The door opened once more, and the world outside seemed to continue on as usual. But for Isabella and JP, everything had changed. They were no longer strangers, but two people bound by a past neither of them had expected to confront. Mini Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She looked at JP one last time before turning her attention to the screen. She was already dialing a number, one she hadn't called in years. Her fingers hesitated for a moment, but then she pressed the call button. JP watched in silence, unsure of what was happening. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath as Isabella spoke quietly into the phone. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness to it that left no room for argument. Hi, it's Isabella Westbrook, she began, her tone sharp but measured. I need to arrange a meeting. Today, if possible. Yes, it's urgent. Jape didn't know who she was talking to, but the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. A strange feeling stirred within him. Fear, hope, and a strange sense of redemption. He had never expected that his simple need for food would lead to a meeting with someone like Isabella, let alone something deeper and more personal. The conversation was brief. Isabella ended the call with a firm promise, then set her phone down with a look of determination. We're going to get to the bottom of this, she said, turning back to Jape. Jape blinked in confusion. The bottom of what? Of everything, Isabella replied quietly. The past, your son, my father, and this watch. She motioned to the timepiece on his wrist, which seemed to have taken on a symbolic weight in the moment. I know that this watch means something far more than just an heirloom. It's a key, a connection to something that's been lost for too long. Jape sighed, his shoulders slumping. You don't understand, Miss Westbrook. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be part of what happened between your father and my son. But here we are, connected by the smallest of things. He looked down at his hands, worn and calloused, as if they could somehow explain the years of regret and longing he had buried deep within himself. Daniel, he was everything to me, and I lost him. Isabella's eyes softened. She could hear the pain in his voice, the same pain that had lived in her heart for years, a pain that had been buried under layers of business deals, family secrets, and unanswered questions. Now, standing before JP, she realized that there was so much more to the story than she had ever known. I understand more than you think, Isabella said gently. My father's death was never just about business, and I know Daniel wasn't just a partner to him. There's more to this story. There's something neither of us has ever been told, but we can figure it out together. Jape shook his head, his voice trembling with emotion. I don't know if I'm ready to face it, Miss Westbrook. The past is too dark. It took too much from me. Isabella placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her expression resolute. I know it's hard, but sometimes you have to face the past in order to move forward. If you let me help you, we can find the answers you've been searching for. You don't have to do it alone anymore. For the first time in years, Jape felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. It wasn't the blind trust he had once given to those he loved, but something more fragile, yet sincere. A trust in the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption and peace, even after all this time. As he looked into Isabella's eyes, he saw not just the daughter of the man who had been his son's business partner, but someone who shared his pain, a woman who understood the weight of loss, the depth of regret, and the power of forgiveness. I'll help you, Isabella repeated. We'll face it together, and we'll find the truth. Jape nodded slowly, a tear escaping down his cheek. The words didn't come easily, but they were there, buried beneath the years of silence. Thank you, he whispered. As Isabella smiled softly, she knew that this moment was just the beginning. It wasn't just about a watch or a cafe confrontation. It was about unraveling the tangled threads of a past that had kept them both captive for so long. But now they had each other, and perhaps together they could finally uncover the truth and heal the wounds that had remained open for far too long. The cafe was once again filled with the soft murmur of conversation as patrons sipped their drinks, oblivious to the profound exchange that had just occurred. But for Isabella and Jape, the world had shifted. The silence between them now carried a new weight, a promise that they would face the future with courage, no matter what secrets the past held. And as the door of the cafe swung open, bringing in a gust of cool air, they both knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But for the first time in a long time, they were no longer walking that path alone. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty, but also with an unexpected sense of purpose. Isabella and Jape began meeting regularly, unraveling the mystery of their shared past, one painful thread at a time. They learned more about each other than they could have ever anticipated, about the betrayals, the misunderstandings, and the secrets that had shaped their lives. Jape shared stories of his son, Daniel, a bright and ambitious man who had dreamed of something bigger than the humble life Jape had known. Daniel had left home years ago, promising to return, but he never did. Jape's heart broke as he confessed how he had been left behind, unsure of what had truly happened to his son. Had Daniel been taken from him by forces he didn't understand? Or had his ambition driven him too far away from the family that had once meant everything to him? Isabella, for her part, shared the story of her father, Charles Westbrook. He was a powerful businessman who had made his fortune through ruthless dealings. But what Isabella hadn't known until much later in life was that her father's success had come at the cost of many lives, Daniel's life among them. Charles had been a man who'd made his name by silencing those who got in his way, and Daniel had been one of his most unfortunate casualties. The discovery of this truth shook Isabella to her core. She had known her father to be distant, but she had never suspected that his dealings had stretched so far into the lives of innocent people. As she dug deeper, she learned that Charles had not only cut ties with Daniel, but had been responsible for his disappearance. He had made a deal with Jape's son, one that had ultimately led to betrayal and a family broken beyond repair. Jape, for all his years of bitterness and heartbreak, never fully understood what had happened to Daniel, but Isabella's revelations brought a terrible clarity. It was Charles's ambition, his need to control and dominate, that had led to Daniel's downfall. The son who had once dreamed of making his mark had been lost in the treacherous currents of a world he hadn't fully understood. But even in the wake of this painful realization, something changed within JP. With Isabella by his side, he began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just for the people who had wronged him. It was for himself, and perhaps, with time, it could bring him peace. Isabella, too, was transformed by the process. She had spent her entire life trying to live up to her father's legacy, only to discover the man she had admired and feared was a villain in the story of others. As the weight of his sins pressed on her shoulders, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught about success and power. Could she escape the shadow of her father's influence? Could she build a life where kindness and compassion were valued above profit and control? The answer was a tentative yes. Together they began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of their shared history felt too heavy to bear. But with every conversation, every confession, they began to heal. Slowly, they made plans to honor Daniel's memory, not as a casualty of their family's struggles, but as a man with dreams and hopes that deserved to be remembered. The cafe where it all began remained a quiet witness to their growing bond. The once cold, dismissive atmosphere had shifted into one of understanding. Isabella, once a figure of business acumen and authority, now found herself using her position to bring positive change. The cafe, under her influence, began offering more than just meals to the customers. It became a place of refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn, a place where dignity was restored, one small act of kindness at a time. And for JP, it wasn't just about the sandwich anymore. It wasn't about the small comfort he had received that day. It was about reclaiming the parts of himself that had been lost along the way, his pride, his hope, and his faith in humanity. As he sat in that same cafe, now more often than not alongside Isabella, he began to feel the stirring of something new, a sense of belonging, a sense of being seen. One afternoon, as they sat together in the corner of the cafe, Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand gently on JP's. "We'll find a way to honor Daniel," she said softly. "We'll make sure he's remembered, and that your story isn't lost either." Jape nodded, his eyes welling with tears once again. But this time, they weren't tears of shame or regret. They were tears of release, of understanding, of peace that had come after so many years of searching for it. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice steady. "I never thought I'd find this peace." Isabella smiled, a soft, knowing smile. Sometimes the hardest paths lead us to where we're meant to be. The cafe, once a place of quiet judgment, had now become a symbol of redemption. And in the story of JP and Isabella, there was a lesson about humanity, about the power of forgiveness, and about the unexpected connections that can change everything. As they stood up to leave that afternoon, a new chapter began to unfold. Their journey together had only just begun. But for the first time in a long time, they felt ready to face whatever came next, together. This story reminds us of the power of compassion and standing up for what's right. If it moved you, subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this.